It all started when John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or most likely known under the alias JFK, said,
"We choose to go to the moon."
In his speech at Rice University. His speech was held just 7 years before the launch of Apollo 11. Even though he wasn't there when it launched because of his assassination, his speech was still an important part to the start of Apollo. But before we start, we have to talk about the Apollo missions. The first Apollo mission was Apollo 1. The astronauts who were going to be on the Apollo 1 were Edward White, Virgil Grissom, and Roger Chaffee. The goal was to test the craft in low orbit around the Earth. There was a pre-test that needed to be done before the actual launch itself. During the test, in the command module, some of the equipment caught on fire, and this is what the control room heard during their final moments. Sadly, all 3 astronauts died. This was considered one of the most horrific spacecraft accidents in history, but that did not stop NASA from continuing on their mission to bring a man to space. The Apollo mission that sent a module into space was the Apollo 5. The Apollo 5 program had the best rocket ever built at the time. It was capable of putting astronauts to the moon. After its test, it was considered a success. This was a year before the launch of Apollo 11. The Apollo 6 was the last Apollo mission that had no crew inside. During the flight, structural panels were lost from the lunar module adapter. Then, after a reignition stage didn't work, it was able to be recovered once it came back to Earth in good condition. It was not considered a success. Since the Apollo 6 was the last Apollo mission to have no crew, unsurprisingly, the Apollo 7 mission was the first crewed mission, other than the Apollo 1. It was an 11-day mission, and because of the duration of time they were in space orbiting, they were able to perform various tests. When they came back to Earth, they landed in the Atlantic Ocean on the 22nd of October. This is a huge feat in aerospace engineering, because if you think about it, in 1968, women still drank or smoked while pregnant. The Apollo 8 was the first spacecraft to orbit the moon. The people on Apollo 8 were Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. These were the first people ever to witness the moon up close. They even took a famous photograph called the Earthrise. It shows the Earth rising over the moon. They returned back to Earth after a 6-day journey. The Apollo 8 spacecraft landed in the Pacific Ocean. The Apollo 9 was the third crewed Apollo flight and the first crewed flight to include the lunar module. The Apollo 9 wasn't that interesting, but it was the first flight to test the lunar module. A lunar module is what is supposed to bring the astronauts safely to the surface of the moon. It was in space for about 10 days before it landed in the Atlantic Ocean. The Apollo 10 spacecraft was basically a rehearsal for the actual moon landing that will happen with the Apollo 11 spacecraft. It was used to test everything that would be done on the actual moon landing except the actual landing itself. The only thing stopping the astronaut from landing was the fact they wouldn't have enough fuel to land and come back to Earth. People thought they were short-fueled on purpose because they knew that they would be willing to land even though their critical order was not to. 2 months later, after Apollo 10, the Apollo 11 would break the space barrier and bring a man to the surface of the moon. The Apollo 11 spacecraft was the most iconic and recognizable Apollo missions. It may have started as a goal for JFK, but it ended as a memorable spot in history forever. The Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, as the countdown for the launch started. Over 53 million people watching on their televisions as they see Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin go farther than any other human on Earth. They take off towards the moon and everything is going well. Each stage of the launch is going perfectly and effortlessly. 3 days later, they were in the position of the moon to begin orbiting. A day later, they finally begin the stages of descent. At first, the 12:02 alarm kept distracting them because the monitors were covered completely. At the time, monitors didn't look like monitors that we have today. It looked like the panel that airplane pilots use when they input information into the computer. Eventually, the alarms were disabled and they were able to continue their descent. Neil Armstrong took semi-control of the craft and started to maneuver the craft into a clear area. At first, there was a crater that they had to pass, but when they were up close to the ground, rocks and other debris started kicking up and restricting Neil Armstrong's view. One of the contact lights went off on the probe, which means that the probe has come in contact with something. As soon as this happens, you are supposed to turn off the engine. So that's what Neil did. Then they completed the landing on Sunday, July 20th. That is how Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, breaking the barrier of space farther than anyone else. It might have started as a dream of JFK, but it ended in a memorable spot in history to be forever be remembered and taught to the people. Just the idea of Apollo 11 mission got a lot of kids interested in being involved in space. One of those kids was me.